I'll be speaking to Paul Hodel, a longtime peace activist, the president emeritus of Promoting Enduring Peace. And in particular, we're going to talk about June 12th, 1982, a peace demonstration in Central Park, New York City, against nuclear weapons. Good afternoon, Paul.
Hello, Stan. Thanks for having me here.
Okay. That peace demonstration, that was about what topic? What were people concerned with on June 12th?
Well, the peace demonstration took place in 1982 because there was a special session of the United Nations that was occurring at that time to consider the issue of disarmament of nuclear weapons. Now, this was the second special session on disarmament. There had been an earlier special session on disarmament that took place in 1978. I was involved in organizing for that too, in terms of organizing peace demonstrations at that time to try and challenge the United Nations delegates to address the threat of nuclear weapons. So that demonstration took place in 77, 78. It was not nearly as large as the demonstration that took place in 82. But still, it's important, I think, to put the demonstration from 82 in that larger historic context. In fact,
and the reports say that 1 million people gathered in Central Park, and that made it the largest anti-nuclear demonstration and the largest political demonstration in the United States. 1 million people.
Yep, it was great. It was a great thing. But again, it's important, I think, to understand the background of it, because there have been a strong peace movement that had been growing certainly since the time of the Vietnam War. And I still remember being involved with peace groups who were talking about what we could do to both address the roots of war. Why was it that the United States had maintained the long war in Vietnam? And then what could we from the peace movement do to get to the roots of that war? And also what could we do to try and establish some degree of peace in the future? So peace groups were very much involved in planning for that demonstration that took place in 82. So,
and Randall Forsberg had written a piece about nuclear disarmament. And was it she who came up with the idea of the nuclear freeze?
Actually, Randy Forsberg, but then some other people too had been talking about ways that we could address the dangers of nuclear weapons. So she may have come up with that phrase. I'm not sure, freeze, but we've been working with the idea of a moratorium on nuclear weapons. And I think using the freeze was just to popularize it, because moratorium was just a more complicated concept.
And what did that mean, freeze? What did you want the big powers to do?
Well, basically, we wanted the United States and the Soviet Union to freeze the development, production, and deployment of nuclear weapons. So we wanted to focus on that. So again, we're trying to get to the roots of the threat of nuclear weapons. And so we wanted to go through the process, so to speak. So understanding the research and development of nuclear weapons, we wanted to freeze that, to stop that production, the development and deployment of those. So it was trying to freeze the process of that. And also we were trying to push for the Soviet Union to do something similar, to follow that. And let me say that at that time, there were some negotiations that were taking place. I mean, there were some leaders of Congress, it's hard to imagine nowadays, but there were leaders of Congress who were really addressing the danger of nuclear weapons. And the two principal persons in the Congress, senators, were Mark Hatfield, who was a Republican from Oregon. That time, he's now gone, but it was Mark Hatfield and Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts, who was he was the Democrat who was pushing for it. So there's a bipartisan effort to try and address the threat of nuclear weapons. In fact, they ultimately a book was published about the work of developing the freeze resolution and things. And in this book, I should say that there's a list of many of the organizers from the United States who are involved in supporting the freeze resolution.
I understand it was introduced into the legislatures of 9 states and passed in 8 of them.
Yes, that's right. And it certainly was introduced in Connecticut. I remember that. In fact, at that time, Irving Stolberg was the Speaker of the House, and he had already done some work before he became Speaker of the House. He'd been involved in work as a professor and also as just a student of the United Nations, who was very interested in getting the state of Connecticut to take seriously the work of the United Nations and the need to address the threat of nuclear weapons. And so he pushed through a resolution at that time, calling for nuclear disarmament. And again, it was the work of legislatures like in Connecticut that helped to push the United Nations along to address this question.
So this is going on in the 70s. Jimmy Carter's president. And
Yes.
then Reagan comes in and people get very frightened because he had talked about vastly increasing the armaments of the United States and the possibility of nuclear war seemed pretty real. I think that's the background of what's going on in 1982. So
Yep.
people started organizing for this rally. You remember how many months earlier people started organizing?
Well, we'd already been organizing. Again, this goes back to in the 70s. I connected back to the peace movement in the Vietnam War and trying to get to the roots of war, though. And so we'd already been organizing, and we did organizing in 70s. Again, we organized against for the first special session on disarmament, took place in the late 70s. And then we were at that same time doing a series of teach-ins around the country. We did several teach-ins in New Haven. And this was working through another network of peace organizations. We called it Mobilization for Survival. And Mobilization for Survival had come together again in 76, 77, when Sidney Lenz, labor organizer, published an article in the Progressive magazine called The Day Before Doomsday. And that was addressing the nuclear danger at that time. And I remember that article was very important. That publication it brought together different peace groups to say, this articulates our vision of what the dangers are and what we need to do to overcome this. So, and in fact, you've talked about Jonathan Schell, who wrote a book in '82 about the fate of the Earth, the danger of nuclear weapons at that time. But
It was also a film, I don't remember its name, but it was a film about this is what would happen if there was a nuclear war. And I remember as a school teacher, everybody said, the kids will see this, people will freak out, and so we prepared the children for it in our social studies classes. And the kids did not freak out, but the parents certainly, and I assume a lot of the older kids did take it to heart. It was a cultural phenomenon, and people were getting very concerned. And so how did the people get to New York? Was it trains or buses, or did most people drive? How did you get there?
Oh, it was trains. And in fact, as being one of the principal organizers here in New Haven, I was in communication with the Connecticut, what do they call the train directly to New York?
Metro
Anyway,
North?
Yeah, okay. So I was in regular communication with them, and we signed up for seats on the train, and they gave us a good price for it. We had asked for, I think, we started out with one car, and then it went to 2 cars and 3 cars, and the movement built up as we were getting people organized, and ultimately we had we had more than 1,000 people left from New Haven.
1,000 people.
At least that, if not more. We just kept filling train cars. I remember this and negotiating right up to the very end, right up to the day before June 12th. I was because I was getting lots of phone calls from people who wanted to get tickets. We had lots of tickets. It was just an amazing time that there was such enthusiasm. I mean, again, we'd had these teach-ins, and so that was a part of setting the educational base for it and trying to build a movement at that time. And so I think the people who joined us, they were already aware of this. And so I think there was a great enthusiasm. I'm feeling like we're really going to accomplish something by showing up on June 12th in '82.
So you took the train to Grand Central and walked, I assume, to Central Park, or maybe
Yes.
subway. How did
Oh.
you get to Central Park? Do you remember?
I am not sure. I don't remember. I remember
1,000 people on the subway, or even on the
there were a
street?
lot of people who were there, and
Yeah.
I remember also we went to I don't know, I'm forgetting just what the facilities were that were close to the United Nations. I again was working through Quakers, and so there's a Quaker UN office. I remember being in the Quaker UN office, and then but how we moved between, I mean, I should say one of the things, it was packed. It was just so amazing. There were so many people there to get around. It was difficult. I remember we were so tightly packed together. I remember moving along for a long time. So I don't remember distances or things like that, and
Right.
how close everything was, from how far it was from Central Station to the United Nations. I don't recall that, but I just remember a lot of people, a lot of us being pushed along, and we had different stations that you could stop along the way to drink and get ready to deal with it was a beautiful day. It was a good day to have a demonstration. I'll say that.
I bet.
Okay, but anyway, I was just
So-
saying that people were coming from different places. I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, people in New York from their different coffee houses or churches, things like that. They were coming together to be a part of this movement along the way towards Central Park.
And who were some of the speakers when you got there and were listening?
Yes, well, among the speakers were Helen Caldecott, was an Australian pediatrician who had been a major spokesperson for the nuclear disarmament and the threats. She had come from Australia, and she said that the people in Australia and Europe were very fearful about what was happening in the United States and with the Soviet Union. So she thought it was key to come here to get we citizens in the United States to get organized, to put pressure on Ronald Reagan, and then also to try and push the Reagan administration to negotiate with the administration of who was in the Soviet Union, who was the leader in the Soviet Union at that time, who would have been, I think, it was not Brezhnev at that time. I'm drawing a blank on the name.
Yeah, it was before Gorbachev. Gorbachev is a little bit later, and Reagan does negotiate with him.
Yes, he
There was a
does.
series of Soviet leaders. Didn't last that long, but they got sick, they died, whatever.
Yeah, and let me say one other thing. Speaking about Helen Caldecott, she actually went along with other peace delegates to meet with Ronald Reagan to try and push him along the way. And I remember this too, that Reagan had been threatened by the peace movement, who'd been speaking out. In fact, one of his children was a student at Yale at that time. I remember Reagan wrote an editorial in the Yale Daily News and also in the New Haven Register, saying that it was a danger to have peace groups speaking out so strongly against this. So, anyway, going back to speakers, Daniel Ellsberg was a key speaker at the demonstration, the UN demonstration. And let me say that Ellsberg had already spoken in New Haven as a part of the teachings that were, he was one of the principal people who helped us to do this series of teachings sponsored by Mobilization for Survival. So in fact, Ellsberg spoke at a variety of other mobilization teachings. I was involved with the ones in New Haven, but they were also taking place in Boston, along with Randy Forsberg, I think you made reference to, and other people. We had
It's kind of ironic that, so this is 82, and Ellsberg doesn't come out for another, I don't know, almost 40 years before he talks about his own role in the nuclear weapons program. I mean, people remember him for Vietnam, but as he revealed just a couple of years ago, he was absolutely at the top in nuclear weapons planning, and he saw that the Eisenhower doctrine on war with Russia was simply, if there was war, throw everything we had at them. And in the first day or two, something like 400 million people would be killed, some unbelievable number. And he kept quiet about that and then wrote about this just a couple of years ago.
Well, it was published in a book several years ago, but actually he was speaking about that already. In fact, I remember him being during the teaching that he was speaking at great length about his involvement in nuclear weapons planning. I remember it vividly because he was getting quite emotionally distraught about it. I remember that his daughter Mary Ellsberg, who was a student at Yale, and then his son Robert Ellsberg, who was in New York City, they were coming there together to be supportive to their father as he was describing his involvement with the nuclear industry and his need he wanted to push. And he was a part of this group of people through Mobilization for Survival to be speaking out against the threat of nuclear weapons and calling for disarmament. And Reagan had, the article that he wrote attacked Daniel Ellsberg because he said Daniel Ellsberg is a traitor and things like that. So
we say that again. Reagan wrote an article saying Ellsberg was a traitor?
Yes,
wow.
Was a traitor, and it just was consistent with his opposition to the Vietnam War. So he considered Ellsberg a traitor for that, and then now speaking out against nuclear weapons. So that's something that was, it was an article that Reagan had written that appeared, I don't know, it was in the Register, I think also the Yale Daily News. So he was quite threatened by this, and the reason that I know that is because, again, I said one of his children was a student at Yale at that time, and so that child made him aware, made him understand that there was a citizens movement, a strong citizens movement here in New Haven that was speaking out against his policies.
So you mentioned Ellsberg, and
I mentioned Benjamin Spock, Helen Caldecott.
You mentioned Caldecott, Benjamin Spock. Now, a lot of people these days don't know who he was. Who was Benjamin Spock?
Benjamin Spock was a famous pediatrician, baby doctor, and he had become quite known. He wrote a best-selling book about how to care for your babies. Mm-hmm. I think when you and I were babies,
Spock babies, every well, I don't know about every single one, but most parents bought that book. That was the Bible of child rearing in the 50s and 60s.
Yep, and then it was Benjamin Spock who was saying, now those of us babies, we were now adults, and he was concerned about these children, these adults now continuing to live and survive, and he began to speak out against the threat of nuclear weapons. And so that was very important, that because Spock gave a certain credibility to the whole thing, and people could accept our push for disarmament when you've got Benjamin Spock speaking out. And Spock was also speaking out against the Reagan administration's bill above nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
So
Was William Sloane Coffin a speaker?
yes, William Sloane Coffin was the speaker, and Coffin he'd been the chaplain at Yale for many years, but now he was in New York City, and he was at the Central Church in New York City, speaking out against nuclear weapons. And so he was one of the leaders of the movement. In fact, Coffin, after he'd left Yale, his involvement in the peace movement led him to take leadership in the Freeze campaign. In fact, he became, when we wanted to establish a formal office, he became the director of the Freeze campaign at that time. And he was a very articulate man. In fact, as he was leading this Riverside Church in New York City, we began doing a series of teachings at churches around the country. It was called Riverside on the Road. And these were disarmament conferences that we had at different local churches at different states. Here in New Haven, we did a variety of conferences talking about the need for disarmament. Again, this was moving from the Riverside in New York City to the Riverside in New Haven, places like that. So
do you remember
again,
the names of any
So-
other speakers that day? Or,
other speakers.
or how about entertainers? Do you remember? I assume there'll be a singer or two.
Oh, there were lots of singers, but
How
I
about
don't.
Pete Seeger? Was he there?
Yes, Pete Seeger was there. In fact, Pete Seeger was a very important singer. In fact, Pete spoke out regularly against the nuclear threat. And so, in fact, when Pete came to New Haven to do a big concert here, he was very much connected to all of this. And I think a local singer, one of the singers who participated was Charlie King. And Charlie King was quite noted at that time. Charlie, I'll say, was following in the footsteps of Pete Seeger. And I think Pete was involved with a group of people from the Hudson River who was trying to preserve the health of Hudson River. So
Right, revive it, because the Hudson at that time was kind of like a sewer.
yes,
So they
that's
did
right.
all these things to revive its health.
Yep. And so there's a good coordination, you can say, between those of us working for nuclear disarmament and the environmental movement. So, in fact, let me say, with regard to mobilization for survival, that our themes were zero nuclear weapons, stop the arms race, ban nuclear power, restore our communities. So those were all themes that were essential to the organizing that we were doing and trying to get community groups involved with our efforts.
So mainly you were doing this through the mobilization. Were you active in promoting enduring peace at that time?
Yes, I was with Promoting Enduring Peace. I've been asked to become a part of the board at that time. I was in my early 20s at that time. And so they brought me out as the youngest person on the board at that time to join. But because of the close relationship that I had with Howard Fraser, who was the director of Promoting Enduring Peace at that time, that Howard, in fact, and I had done some organizing again here in New Haven to get speakers here and things like that. Let me also say a very important point, speaking about speakers, were survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were alive at that time and still able to speak. And in fact, the survivors were key to so many of us. They really helped to push the peace movement and all of us to recognize the dangers of nuclear weapons. So they were key, and they were survivors who spoke during that time. And Robert Lifton, who was a Gandhi Award recipient, Lifton had made the survivors' message very, very well known through his book, Death and Life, Survivors of Hiroshima. And
speaking of the Gandhi Peace Award, so many of these people that you've talked about were given the Gandhi Peace Award by Promoting Enduring Peace.
That's right, yeah.
I mean, Lifton and Caldecott
and let me say that Lifton, while Spock spoke of a doctor speaking, Lifton was a psychiatrist, and so he spoke at the demonstration on June 12th.
And I believe he's still alive in his 90s.
Yes, right.
Occasionally, we see that he will write something pretty
Well,
impressive.
he wrote a lot of books, and
So you must have felt pretty good coming home that day.
well, we felt we'd done a good job of demonstration and trying to push for things. So we were feeling optimistic about what had been accomplished. But on the other hand, we knew we had a lot of work to do from that time on. Let me also say that I'm thinking about the kind of work we had to do to try and push the legislature to support the Hatfield Kennedy administration for senators to push for nuclear disarmament. Let me also say that at that time we were going immediately when we came back, we met with the Congress people at that time. I think the congressperson at that time in New Haven would have been Bob Jimo. We'd pushed Jimo while also to stop the production of the B-1 bomber at that time. Then we met with Jimo, or maybe the person who came after Jimo was Larry DeNardis. He was a Republican, and I'll say that DeNardis met with us, and he was willing to hear us out, even though he didn't agree. But he met with us. He saw the significance of the citizens movement that existed here, and so in fact, I should say, I guess so. By '82, with June 12th, that time, Bruce Morrison had been running against DeNardis, and I remember that Bruce Morrison came and joined us on the trains. Realized this was important. In fact, it was thanks to, I think, the movement that helped to build a lot of people to push to ultimately DeNardis was unseated and Bruce Morrison took his place, because Bruce was taking a strong stand for the nuclear freeze.
That's right. And then you had Reagan was affected by all this. I'm reading Jonathan Schell's article from 2007. And he says, well, Reagan proposed, now by this time Gorbachev gets in, and Reagan says, well, let's have this Star Wars anti-missile system. Let's both sides get it. We'll let the Soviet Union know how to make this. We'll both get it, and then we'll get rid of all nuclear weapons. And people thought he was being, false about this. But he did negotiate with Gorbachev, and they came up with an agreement, and there was for years disarmament treaties. Not lately, but there were then.
That's true. There was division, and let's say that there were scientists who were very much supportive of this, and there's an important nuclear weapons treaties have been, efforts to try and reduce the number of nuclear weapons. So those treaties did exist. Things that now have all been dismantled under the Trump administration, pulled us back from that. Oh, let me say one other thing that's very important about the movement and these treaties in that. There was a European peace movement was very strong at that time. And let me say that that time the Europeans were very concerned about the nuclear weapons that were being deployed in Europe. And there's a strong European peace movement, disarmament movement. In fact, the leader of the peace movement in Europe that I remember from that time was Bruce Kent. In fact, Bruce Kent came here to the United States to speak out against the United States deploying cruise missiles and Pershing II missiles in Europe. And there were huge demonstrations that took place in Europe. I remember that we were doing simultaneous. We had Bruce Kent here in New Haven. And so I remember that kind of that interaction between European peace activists and US peace activists was very important. And there are other European peace activists who spoke in some of these Riverside on the Road conferences I made reference to and other things. So there's very important communication between us and the European activists.
And here we are 40 years later, and there had been that progress for a while, And then the 90s came, Soviet Union fell apart. There was a possibility of really getting rid of nuclear weapons, but the US wasn't really that interested, Clinton, as far as I can see. And so we modernized. Every president's been modernizing the nuclear weapons. And then Putin has been developing these supersonic delivery systems for the weapons, making the times that between launch and when you have to make a decision of what to do even shorter and shorter and shorter. And I don't know, we don't have that anti-nuclear movement like we did when you were one of the leaders back in the early 80s.
Well, that's true. I'm sorry to say. It's the time is so different. It's the way of communication. It's just amazing to realize that today we have the internet and things like that. So you can get information quickly back and forth between people. But I remember when we were doing the organizing in the towards the 82 demonstration, we talked on the phone all the time, and and there were vigils that taking place, and then people really engaged in all kinds of ways. And now the internet it's changed things a lot. People feel that they've been really active if they send an email, but
I mean, there's been activism even in the middle of the pandemic. In 2020, you had the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, which were huge. I mean, in numbers. So what do I remember? Something like a quarter of American adults were involved. I mean, that's beyond belief.
Yep, you're right about that. Yeah, so things change, and the technology changes, and we have to adapt ourselves and find other ways to become effective, to challenge our leaders to try and achieve nuclear weapons disarmament.
Well, thanks for talking with me about June 12th, 1982, the biggest anti-war, anti-nuclear demonstration ever. Thank you, Paul Hodel.
Thank you, Stan.